Hello everyone, your dear old Uncle Otter is back. This time we're talking about stats you need for endgame viability. In essence, this guide is going to give you a loose guideline for gearing your character to be as effective as possible in the late game. Before we begin in earnest, a few points of order. As with all things Grim Dawn, this stuff is pretty complicated and everything has exceptions to their rules. I'm going to do my best to explain the most prevalent caveats, but know that none of these are hard and fast rules. Next, many of these numbers, especially numbers dealing with damage scaling, are arbitrary and are better used as a goal or a ballpark estimate rather than a necessity. Finally, there's going to be a handy navigation guide in the description, so if you want to bone up on a specific topic, you can navigate directly to it, or if you just want to see the numbers and nothing more, they'll be time-stamped at the end of the video. With that being said, let's do the damn thing. Kicking us off is arguably the most important defensive stat of all, resistance. Simply put, resistance reduces the amount of damage you take by a specific damage type by exactly that percent. So for example, if you've got 50% lightning resistance and you get struck by a bolt of lightning, you can expect to take half of that damage. Simple, right? You've probably heard that you need to make sure all of your resistances are capped at 80%, but in reality, that is the bare minimum for endgame. Typically, you want to overcap your resistances by about 25% each. This is because almost every endgame baddie has some form of resistance reduction baked into their kit, and it is a smart idea to mitigate that as much as possible. There is one more damage resistance type that doesn't work like the rest, and that is physical. The way I view physical resistance is simple. If you have it, great, but don't go out of your way to get more of it. Don't get me wrong, it's very, very strong, just rare and not entirely necessary in my experience. The broody and often misunderstood stepbrother to damage resistance is stun and crowd control resistance. To make this as simple as possible, always try to get capped stun resistance on all characters. However, the argument can be made that the sturdier your character, the less necessary stun resistance is, but still, I wouldn't go below 60%. Take this approach for things like freeze, entrapment, and slow resistance. The more your character relies on being at a healthy range, the more crowd control resistance you need, especially entrapment. A single cage from an obsidian or bone giant can spell doom for squishier characters. Up next is that gooey red bar at the bottom left of your screen. You love it, you need it, it's health. The rule of thumb here is 100 health per level, meaning 10,000 health at level 100, but that's the bare minimum. In reality, we need enough health to survive through big damage abilities like Archmage Alexander's Meteor, or a few medium damage abilities in rapid succession. This threshold looks closer to 13,000, but of course there are caveats. If you're running an occultist build with possession, you have the highest source of percent damage absorption in the game, but also no health scaling in the occultist tree itself, so your health total might be a bit lower than 13,000, but that's fine due to the absorption. If you're going into a melee Nightblade build, you might find yourself with a pretty shallow health pool with limited mitigation, so it's important to find other ways to boost your max health or mitigation to keep yourself from getting evaporated. The most ignorable of all defensive stats is of course armor. Armor mitigates the amount of damage you take from bread and butter physical attacks. It's not very important for range builds that rely on kiting for survival, but it's pretty crucial for all melee builds. For range builds, I aim for 1.5 to 2,000 per piece of gear. For high damage and mobility melee builds like the incredibly powerful Dervish, 3 to 3,500 is my threshold, and for meaty stand and fight builds, I go for 4,000 or more. However, what all builds need is armor absorption, which can drastically lower the range of damage enemies deal with physical attacks. For heavy melee builds, 100% armor absorption is a must, but range builds can get away with 90%. Rounding out the defensive stats is defensive ability, which measures our character's ability to dodge attacks and not be crit by enemies. We need to elevate our defensive ability to a point where we are rarely getting crit and effectively never getting crit twice in a row. The magic number for me is 3,000 defensive ability. This may seem like a rather high goalpost for most fresh level 100 builds, but there are ways to lower that threshold, namely by lowering enemies' offensive ability. For example, if you have an ability that lowers enemies' offensive ability by 200, you have effectively increased your defensive ability against that enemy by 200. A good example of this is the wasting node on the Bloody Pox tree. Crossing the threshold into offensive stats is the yin to defensive ability's yang, offensive ability, which, as you may have guessed, directly correlates to our character's ability to land hits and crits on enemies. Consistently hitting and critting is the bedrock of effectively killing things. Just like with defensive ability, we aim for 3,000 offensive ability, but take a more the merrier approach as we attempt to scale up to 3,500 or beyond, depending on the build. Again, we can artificially inflate our defensive ability by shredding enemies' defensive ability by using skills like Flashbang or Curse of Frailty with the vulnerability node. Up next is resistance reduction, the most important stat to stack to increase our damage output. This one gets complex as there are 3 different categories of resistance reduction. The first is reduced target's resistance, for example the Rowan's Crown and Manticore devotions, and the second type being percent reduced target's resistance, for example Ultos Shepherd of Storms, and the Viper devotions. What's important here is that different types of these will not stack within the same category. For example, if my character has both Ultos and Viper, Ultos will always override Viper because it has a higher base value. But if my character has both Ultos and Rowan's Crown, they will stack because they are of different categories. However, the most important category is the last one, worded as -% resistance. For example, Devouring Swarm and Curse of Frailty. This is the category of resistance reduction that we need to stack as high as possible in our gear, devotions, and components. For further clarity, check out Sino's incredibly useful resistance reduction chart linked in the description. Finally, the meat and potatoes of our damage stats is of course percent bonus damage. The beauty of this stat is that you never really need to go out of your way to find it. Simply by equipping yourself with relevant gear and following a common sense devotion path, you'll end up with a pretty respectable amount of bonus damage to your primary element. By the time you reach endgame, your character should typically have around 2,300% bonus to your primary damage type, and, if you have a secondary, around 1,500%. So, let's put it all together. At level 100, a character should have all resistances overcapped by around 25%. Capped stun, freeze, and entrapment resistance, especially if you're ranged. At least 13,000 maximum health, 2,000 armor with 92% absorption for range builds, up to 4,000 armor with 100% absorption for melee builds. At least 3,000 defensive ability, accounting for enemy offensive ability shred. At least 3,000 offensive ability, accounting for enemy defensive ability shred. As many sources of -% resistance as possible, and finally at least 2,300% bonus to your primary damage. Thank you so much for watching. I know this is a bunch of information and not a lot of it is very straightforward, so if you are still confused, feel free to drop a comment for any questions you may still have. Before I go, I want to talk to you about something a bit more serious. I don't even have to like, comment, or subscribe, but I'm worried that you're going to look back at your life in 10 or 20 years and wonder, what if, you know? It's just, I don't want you to end up like me, kiddo. I live in a Winnebago and I sleep on a loose pile of Cindy Crawford tapes and regrets. I guess what I'm saying is, don't be afraid to live your life. And definitely like, comment, and subscribe to Armored Otter.